Okay, we're continuing from my book, The Holy Grail of Wisdom Quotes. That's me, Pete Rogers, in alphabetical order. We're doing Eric Havelock first. He's a scholar of ancient Greece, so we're going to talk about some of the things he said. And one of the key points he makes is that when the ancient Greeks would teach, they always teach with a human person in a story, giving a direct example of a behavior. So this young lady here is Antigone. And she is the daughter of Oedipus, Oedipus Rex. He was the king who made the mistake, married his mother, killed his father, had a baby because he didn't know. It was his fate. Okay? And anyways, and this is Theseus, the ruler of Athens, who allowed Oedipus in his old age to be a welcome guest because he knew it wasn't Oedipus' fault. He didn't do it on purpose. It was his fate to stay in Athens. Okay? So this is showing a young person who learns a story that this is how you should behave. You should be noble. You should be magnanimous. You should be forgiving. And a daughter should be loyal to her father, okay, and to her family. Okay, so this is a classic picture. The play Oedipus Rex is one of the greatest of all time Greek plays. Okay, so now we're going to show the next painting here. And this is Antigone. She had two brothers, Polynices and Eteocles. And there was sort of a civil war battle over who was going to be the ruler of Thebes. And this brother of hers, Polynices, was killed, and King Creon said, I'll leave him to the dogs, he doesn't deserve a burial. But she said, no, there are rules above you, the king, that come from the gods, and all men deserve a burial. So she went to bury her brother, and then King Creon sentenced her to death. And it actually showed terrible consequences for this behavior on the part of Creon as well, because his son was in love with Antigone and engaged to her. And when Antigone was executed, he committed suicide. And when the wife of King Creon saw that her son had committed suicide, she committed suicide. So King Creon, a total jerk, ruined everything, okay? He should have forgiven Antigone. She did the right thing by her brother. Okay, so the reason I'm showing you these paintings is to show you that in ancient Greece, if somebody said, this is how a daughter should behave, they say, look how Antigone took care of Oedipus. Look how Antigone buried her brother. That is how a daughter should behave. And here then is Penelope. Penelope was the wife of Odysseus. And Odysseus had been gone for a long time, 10 years fighting in the War of Troy in Ilium, okay? And an additional 10 years wandering before he was able to come home, before the gods allowed him to come home. Athena was able to get him home, and Poseidon could block him no longer. And anyways, all this time, his wife in Ithaca, Penelope, had to resist the approaches of the suitors who had long overstayed their welcome. Okay, so when a Greek wanted to say, how should a wife behave, he would say, like Penelope, the wife of Odysseus. And what I'm saying is this is very good for a culture. They have a shared set of stories and history that everyone knows. Be a Penelope, not a sleaze. Be like Antigone, not a bad child, okay? And so that's a good thing. And you get that from whatever is the common stories of a culture. That's another reason why all Western civilization, they should read the Iliad and the Odyssey, study the ancient Greeks. They should know the Bible. They should know their history because it gives you a shared history that you all can communicate with effectively and understand each other. And everybody knows what's a reasonable expectation of them. Okay, so now we're going to get into the quotes. And Eric Havelock, the scholar of Greek literature, here he goes. He says, for memorization of long poems like the Iliad and the Odyssey, a language of action rather than reflection appears to be a prerequisite. All statements have to be narrativized, put into a story. Yeah, you can't just give abstract things like, the Ten Commandments are nice and they're kind of simple and straightforward, but still, you can communicate a lot more information in a story. Our brain is programmed to remember stories, to see events as stories. So they should be taught and told in that way. Just think about the way history is taught in the public schools. They teach events. You have to memorize World War II, 1941 to 1945 or whatever. And that's relatively difficult to remember, especially as one goes further back in time. But it's very easy to remember the behavior of Napoleon, okay? It's very easy to remember the behavior of General George Patton, okay? It should be taught in biography with the individual heroes, and then you remember it. Okay, you want to study the Italian Renaissance, you should know Cesare Borgia, you should know Machiavelli, you should know the Medicis, Michelangelo, Raphael, Pope Julius. Okay, knowing those characters, that's what's memorable, much more so than the dates. Okay, so Havelock continues. That is, they must be names of agents, of people who do things, actual persons, or the forces which are personified. The Greek gods are often, in metaphors. Venus is the goddess of love. Ares is the goddess of war. Okay, Cupid's the other sort of goddess of infatuation. And that makes it memorable when you say, well, Cupid got involved and this is what happened. Okay. Tradition, in short, is taught by action, not by idea or by principle. Okay, and another example I would give of this is, I'm half Irish on my mother's side. I'm sorry, half Puerto Rican on my mother's side, half Irish on my father's side. And here's the relevance, because I know my relatives, cousins, and the related friends. And what I've seen is the Puerto Ricans are much better Christians than the Irish are. Because, an intelligent, sophisticated person, they can work through all the arguments and they can logically, have understood the apologetics, the arguments, the counter-arguments, and how to handle all that. And they can be in a strong intellectual position. But most people, they're just not that interested in reading or thinking, or they're not that bright. And they can't maintain a strong position based simply on arguments and, abstract debate. What am I trying to say is with the Puerto Ricans, being Christian, it's not a philosophic debate. It's in their blood. Jesus Christus is their best friend. That's not negotiable. Okay, they'll die on a hill for that. Okay, they're much stronger Christians, and it exudes the joy that comes out of them. Okay, I've seen it in one after another. My aunts and my mother. Okay, it's a magnificent thing. Okay, whereas I've seen these Irish intellectual lightweights go, well, I don't know about this. One of my Irish Christian cousins actually says she's a Democrat. I'm like, are you stupid? That's like a contradictory statement. You can't be those two things, you idiot. Okay, so anyways, he's making the good point, Eric Havelock, that traditions are taught through stories and narratives about people. That's what we remember. That's what we understand. That's what immediately resonates with another person. Okay, Eric Havelock continues. In orally preserved speech, the subjects of significant statements were always persons. Always persons. Okay, with names, not things or ideas. Oralism had favored the traditional and the familiar, both in content and in style. The need to conserve in memory required that the content of memory be economical. Yeah, they had to have patterns of talking that you could, because this is before it was all written down, that you could remember it and be able to pass it on. The bard, the storyteller, and that's like in Ireland, the musicians are the greatest historians because they're the ones that pass along all the stories of Irish history, and they're magnificent. Okay, just one quick call. We're going in alphabetical order here. Stephen Hawking. Intelligence is the ability to adapt to change. Now, Stephen Hawking, he's this English physicist and cosmologist who was in a wheelchair, and he had ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. And I'd hear all these things that he's a genius, and I listened to him talk, and I'm like, he's a bullshit artist. Okay, I wasn't very impressed by him. Then I heard that while he was in the hospital, despite his terrible illness, he seduced 2 nurses. And I have to say, my respect for him. Maybe he really is a genius. How many guys spinal cord injury, paralyzed, that could seduce 2 nurses? That's not that easy. Okay. I don't think I ever slept with a nurse. Okay, and I was in medical school residency, all that stuff for a long time. Just never happened. All right. So next one is Jeff Hawkins. Jeff Hawkins is this computer guy, real smart guy. He's a guy who invented this Palm Pilot thing, and then he became a neuroscientist, did a lot of research on the brain, and he developed this 1,000 brains theory of intelligence, the idea that our position sense wasn't just in one part of the brain that maintains a position sense, but that it was everywhere. And each individual cortical column of neurons was gauging where things are located based on their relative positions to one another. And, other people have said we navigate cognitive space by, comparisons and metaphors, analogies and stuff. Well, once again, by comparing things to each other. So anyways, here's some words of Jeff Hawkins. His new company is Numenta. He says, individual cortical columns are much more powerful than was previously thought. Each cortical column has grid cells and displacement cells that work in the same way as other cortical columns. And this is what Mountcastle, a previous neuroscientist, had predicted. However, each cortical column is different because it has different inputs and different outputs. Each cortical column has sensory input and motor output. This understanding of how the brain works is called the 1,000 brains theory of intelligence. So the reason he calls it 1,000 brains is, there's more cortical columns than 1,000, but this idea that we don't have just one brain. We have thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of little tiny brains in these cortical columns. Okay, this is his theory. Mountcastle suggested that since all these cortical columns look the same, maybe they all function the same way. The brain learns so it can make better models of the world, so it can make better predictions. The main purpose of neocortex learning and recalling patterns is in order to make predictions. So you want to make better predictions so you can survive. Okay, last time I walked down that path, I got attacked by a couple of coyotes. I don't think I'm going to walk down that path again unless I'm with a bunch of guys and we're ready to fight those coyotes. Okay. Last time I walked down that path, we found, an apple tree, lots of good food. Why I'm hungry. I'm going to go down that path again. That's your predictions. Using your memory and your judgment, you predict new things. Okay, Jeff Hawkins continues. An expert is someone able to perceive more detailed, more sophisticated patterns. The drive to be able to predict drives the desire to understand. This is the memory prediction model of intelligence. Okay, and then a couple of comments by me. We compare new information to that which we know. We prefer the information to come to us in stories or in comparisons like synonyms and antonyms, bipolar opposites, binary opposites. We categorize the information by analogies, by mapping spatial location, temporal location, hierarchical location, categorical, generality versus specificity. So yeah, we make all these little nuanced comparisons because that enables us to understand complex things. Okay, all comparisons are relative to something we already know. We store the information relative to other information. The idea of our scaffold of knowledge is based on comparisons. We continually update our models. Our models of the world enable us to make predictions and thus navigate the world. The way we find stored information is by recalling the stuff it is like with regard to category, story, when and where, and how it happened, etc. Hierarchical relevance, etc. Okay, continuing with Jeff Hawkins. Prediction is the primary function of the neocortex, the cerebral cortex, and the foundation of intelligence. The ability to make predictions is the key feature of intelligence. When the brain builds a model of the world, everything has a location relative to everything else. Location, location, location is a framework for intelligence and cortical computation. If you look at the history of big obstacles in understanding our world, there's usually an intuitive assumption underlying them that's wrong. Yeah, there'll be something that everybody thinks is correct because it seems logical, like that, the Earth is the center of the universe. And until somebody's able to get around that, they can't understand what's the reality. And that's why, it's been said by others like Arthur Koestler, in retrospect, the idea of a genius often seems simple because it took a genius, though, to clear out the intellectual obstacles to understanding the thing and making it clear and stating that clearly. Okay, Jeff Hawkins continues. In the case of the solar system, it seemed intuitively obvious that the Earth was the center and that things moved around us, but that turned out to be wrong. To know something means that you can make predictions about it. Deep Blue didn't win by being smarter than a human. It won by being millions of times faster than a human. The brain builds model of the world and makes predictions. Okay, that's Jeff Hawkins. Okay, we're going to do one more person in our quotes for today, and that's Nathaniel Hawthorne, the author from the 1800s who wrote the magnificent book Scarlet Letter, one of the top 10 all-time great books. It's kind of a scary book. And the idea of the Scarlet Letter is that a good person follows the spirit of the law more so than the letter of the law. Okay, because the good person was actually scarlet, and her man, who was the father of her child, Arthur Dimmesdale, the priest, he actually was a good guy, but he was a wimp, whereas Scarlet was brave. So you should be good and follow the spirit of the law, but you should also be brave, because if you wimp out for too long, you eventually sort of sell out yourself, and that's what happened in Scarlet Letter. Arthur Dimmesdale loved Scarlet, Scarlet loved him, but then her true husband, who she thought was dead, showed up on the scene. Killingsworth was his name, and he was a brutal, evil guy, even though by the letter of the law, he maybe could get away with the things he did. And it was a brutal reality check book. It was rather magnificent and kind of scary book. Okay, so here is a descriptive passage from the book Scarlet Letter. She looked around at her townspeople and neighbors. On the breast of her gown in fine red cloth, surrounded with an elaborate embroidery and fantastic flourishes of gold thread, appeared the letter A. Her beauty shone out and made a halo of her misfortune. But the point which drew all eyes, as it were, transfigured the wearer, was the scarlet letter, so fantastically embroidered and illuminated upon her bosom. It had the effect of a spell, taking her out of the ordinary relations with humanity and enclosing her in a sphere by herself. It was only later that the letter came to mean Abel or perhaps angel. Okay, Nathaniel Hawthorne says, the thing you set your mind on is the thing you will ultimately become. Yeah, that's what I've heard. You should try to focus on your goals and what you want to achieve more so than what's frustrating you, because you'll kind of move towards that. That takes a lot of energy to just say, I will focus on my goals, you know? Like for me, I will focus on writing this book and not all the other things I want to do today. That's what it takes to get stuff done. Focusing your energy. You know, Goethe said we must always strive to concentrate our efforts. Okay, Nathaniel Hawthorne. There's a good one. Religion and art spring from the same root. Yeah. Christians have a worldview that just makes them create beautiful art. That's why, you know, like 19 out of the 20 best books of novels, they're all written by Christians. The only exception is Ayn Rand wrote, you know, Atlas Shrugged, that's up there in the top 20. That's it. The rest are all written by Christians. They're superior at art and literature and architecture and music. Okay, Nathaniel Hawthorne. A hero cannot be a hero except in a heroic world. Yeah, there's some truth in that too. As society becomes so degraded, it doesn't even recognize its heroes anymore. Okay, and you'll see there's a lot of men doing really good things and not getting credit for it. And there's a lot of bad people doing bad things and being rewarded for it, like Hollywood celebrities that are evil scumbags. Okay, like Taylor Swift comes to mind. Okay. Like P. Diddy comes to mind, okay? They're evil. Then their behavior is awful. It's despicable. Okay, Nathaniel Hawthorne continues, all brave men love, for he only is brave who has affections to fight for, whether in the daily battle of life or in physical contests. And that's also a little bit why they wanted to destroy and degrade society so men won't think it's worth defending. You know, like a modern art museum, nobody respects that. But, you know, the Louvre in France or, you know, the Renaissance art, the Victorian Renaissance Catholic Revival art. Yeah, that's magnificent. That's worth defending. There's actually a lot of great artists that are still alive today, but almost no one knows about them because they're not allowed in the museums. The museums are filled up with all this fake garbage, gaslight the public and degrade the public. Okay, Nathaniel Hawthorne continues. Our most intimate friend is not he whom we show the worst, but the best of our nature. A woman's chastity consists, like an onion, of a series of coats. The world owes all of its onward impulses to men ill at ease. Yeah, it's only a person who's sort of pissed off or frustrated that writes a book. A guy who's making lots of money, you know, he's got a wife he can't wait to get home to, and a big family. He just wants to be home and spend time with them. He's not spurred on to write a book to show he's right. Okay, Nathaniel Hawthorne continues. The happy man inevitably confines himself within ancient limits. Yeah, it's plenty to keep a man busy just to support a family and wife and kids. It's a full-time job just doing that. And then here's another, strong quote. Let men tremble to win the hand of a woman unless he wins along with it the utmost passion of her heart. Yeah, because a lot of women will marry a guy just because they want him to support her, almost like he's a placeholder until they think something better will come along. And then you start running this hourglass clock because the older a woman gets, the more she loses her looks and the less of a man she's going to be able to attract. But it's also true, a lot of women have like a placeholder guy who they'll call a beta male or a money bitch, and then she's really waiting and she'll cheat on him because she just felt she had to settle down because her biological clock was ticking and her looks were running out, her fertility is running out. So they're kind of programmed to think that way, and the divorce, no-fault divorce, rewards them for leaving a marriage. So there's a truth in what he says, but it's not that. You can't control a woman unless she wants to have a family. Because what I've seen happen was a woman will say anything when she's a fiancé because she wants to get that magic ring. But whether it's in her core feeling, does she want the family, yes or no? And you'd be amazed how many modern women don't care about their families and will destroy their family. 80% of divorces are filed by the woman. It was like my wife. I couldn't control my wife because she didn't care about the family. It kind of didn't mean anything to her. I grew up in a big, happy family. And so that was just I just took it for granted. We're going to have a big, happy family. It's going to be like when I was growing up. It's going to be great. And I devoted everything to that. And she had more in her mind. She wanted to be rich and the family could fuck off. They can go take a loan. They can do anything they want. She didn't care about it. And because she didn't care about it, we couldn't agree on things. And you don't think the same when you're thinking. Anyways, I won't even go into that anymore. But I hope you enjoyed these quotes of Nathaniel Hawthorne and Havelock and Hawkins.